Our next speaker is Dr. Eve Purdy, who is a Canadian based on the Gold Coast, who says that she dabbles occasionally in emergency medicine and is an anthropologist. And so she's going to be speaking to us about culture. Eve, take it away.
Thanks so much. I am not an Emmy-winning children's show producer, but I'm hoping that today I can share with you a little bit of the research that I do as an anthropologist with healthcare teams that can help you be a part of a team and create a team that maybe feels just like the ones that Joe was describing. I work here as both an anthropologist, somebody who studies culture, as well as an emergency physician. Now, when Eve, the anthropologist, walks up to this building and I get ready to go into work, I think, wow, the emergency department, this is the watering hole of the hospital. This is so cool. This is where everybody comes. This is where everybody gathers. And it's a place that is ripe for understanding people and teams and how we work together. When Eve, as the emergency physician, walks into work, I just hope that this shift goes well. I just hope. And so I am largely an adult emergency physician, but at our site we often work in the kids pod as well. And so I hope a little extra hard when I'm walking into the kids pod that my shift goes well. And on an average day, this is the type of screen that I would come across. This is pretty normal. There's a bunch of handovers in our acute pod. There's a few that need to be seen. Our short stay is full. This is pretty par for the course. I want you to take about 30 seconds and chat with your neighbor. But when you show up to a shift like this, or let's say it's your ward round, or your operating list, or your day at clinic, what makes your average day go well? I'll give you 30 seconds to chat with your neighbor. I'll give you 10 seconds to wrap that up. All right. So on any given day, the outcomes for our patients and for our departments and for our organizations depend on any number of things. And I might have heard a few murmurings, things that we usually talk about, things like roles being allocated, things like maybe some good leadership. We heard a little bit about that from Joe. In a resuscitation situation, things might go well if we've got closed loop communication and situational awareness. These things are all true. These are all behaviors. These are things that we do and that we can see. But underlying all of that is something a little bit more fundamental. And it's absolutely integral that we have a strong and deliberate team culture that allows these good team behaviors and these good outcomes to happen. So on any given shift, I know that this is going to go well if I am working with a good nursing team leader who I have worked with before, who will tell me what I need to do. I know that this will go well if I actually understand what level all of the registrars and juniors that I'm working with are at, so that I can help them with their learning goals, and so that I know exactly how much I should be trusting them. This day will go even better if there's a PEDS critical care consultant who's available and able to help. And it goes extremely well when I learn that the nurse that's floating with us in the emergency department has actually been working for 17 years as a critical care nurse. So there are certain things that make this go well. But how can we move from hoping that this shift will go well to ensuring that we do everything within our control to make it so? And that's where we're just going to get nerdy for just a second. I'll introduce you to one of my favorite theories, and it's a theory that I think really can help us understand how we can ensure that this day goes well. This is a theory called relational coordination theory. I did not make it up, but I have used it and applied it in a number of healthcare contexts. Relational coordination theory comes actually from the airline industry. Jody Hoffer-Gattel is a social scientist who has studied how airlines do their work. And I'm not talking about what we usually talk about, which is cockpits, how pilots navigate challenging circumstances and land on the Hudson. No, I don't really care about that. I mean, it's cool, but it's not our day-to-day work. What is much more similar to our day-to-day work, but doesn't get a lot of airtime, is how passengers get from point A to point B with their bags on time. Now that is complex. These are all of the different groups that are involved in making that happen. And what Jody Hoffer-Gattel found was that there's actually a number of relational factors that make this go well. These groups have shared knowledge, but like Ben was talking about today, we can't all possibly share the same knowledge. What they have is knowledge about each other's roles. They know who is meant to be doing what and when. They have crystal clear shared goals, and they have mutual respect. And we're going to dive into that a little bit more, but it's about far more than being nice. It's about valuing everybody that's coming to the table and recognizing that they have something to offer. Now, all of this needs to take place in the context of communication. Communication that is timely, accurate, problem-solving based, and frequent. Jody Hoffer-Gattel and others have found across contexts that teams that have higher levels of relational coordination do better. In the airline industry, in orthopedics, across business industries. We found this in trauma. So if I go back to my setting of the emergency department, how do I know that this theory is going to apply? How are we actually going to make it work for us? Well, first off, I know it's going to work because this is basically what gets our patients through the emergency department, a complex web supporting them. We know that sometimes patients fall through when these connections are not strong, so our goal has to be to strengthen this web. And to do so, we can focus on shared knowledge about roles. If we go back to my example, that's me understanding what level the registrars are at and what they can and cannot do. It comes back to shared goals. Now, this is where we get into a bit of trouble in healthcare, because my goal as the consultant emergency physician might be quite different than the goal of the people who are operating in theaters upstairs. I think this goal is the source of a lot of our conflict, and actually recognizing that and naming it can be quite helpful. Mutual respect is something that we're going to dive into right now. Mutual respect goes back to what Ben was talking about today. Do we actually fundamentally, seriously believe that the other people that we're working with are adding value to our team, and do we respect what they bring to the table? Sometimes the answer to that question is yes, but I'd venture that often it's no. Mutual respect relies on psychological safety. This is the definition of psychological safety by another excellent social sciences researcher. Again, this is a lot more than being nice. This is one of the nurses on my shift telling me this. Or the cast tech, or a colleague at the end of the shift telling me this, giving me some feedback on my performance. It's a cast tech saying this. Now, research that we've done in the emergency department has shown that psychological safety is dependent on three main factors. There's a small, teensy tiny piece that is individuals' confidence. That was Ben saying, before you call the consultant, just take a second and gather a bit of confidence. There's organizational factors. Do we actually belong to a healthcare system that is continuously trying to get better? Do we build familiarity across specialties? But by far and away, the biggest aspect that is important is our team. Who are we working with on any given day? And if you look at this box, what you see is that familiarity with your team is the biggest chunk of this. Now, many of us work in systems where that is challenging. We have rosters that are changing all the time, but we have to find ways to inject familiarity into our workplaces to be successful. This is what one of our ED nurses tells us. So this is a lot of theory, but how are we going to make it practical? When I walk into this emergency department, when you walk into your place of work, we have to not just hope that our day is going to go well, we have to make it so. There's a series of small moments that we can perform with our team, rituals that we can engage in that will make us more familiar and will enhance relational coordination. They seem painfully simple. The first is something like a shift huddle. When you show up to clinic in the morning, when you show up at the emergency department, meet your team members and come up with a plan of attack for the day. It might be something that looks like this. I'll give you a second. Literally just saying hello, if there's any updates, and setting a bit of a tone for the day. But what we see is this isn't just out of nowhere. This is actually linked to theory that will help your team perform better. We actually have a bit of evidence to start supporting this. We're doing work with our maternity services, and over the past 18 months, we've been working with them and enacting kind of a host of interventions that have been designed by that group and enacted by that group, one of which is shift huddles. To improve, they wanted to focus on postpartum hemorrhage. This is what they tell us about huddles. And we're seeing some results. On the Gold Coast, like everywhere else, I think in Australia, over the past 3 years, the birth rates have skyrocketed. Births have gone from about 4,000 a year to 6,000, and during that time, the rates of severe postpartum hemorrhage have almost halved in our group. Now, it's hard to actually tie exact interventions to outcomes, but we like to think that some of the teamwork strategies that we've been employing with this group are making a difference. The small moments, they matter. Next up, team briefings. This is perhaps a little bit more important for those who are working in critical or more acute care settings. This basically is the equivalent of a shift huddle, but right before a sick patient comes in. You can think about a family member bringing in a sick loved one into our resuscitation bay. I think they'd be a little bit concerned if we didn't know each other's names, let alone what level somebody was at who was joining us in the care of this patient. Pre-briefings are designed to get that all out on the table. And again, this is what our practitioners say. Traumas go better when it happens. And again, this is all linked to theory. We can see how a simple structure for a team briefing actually relates directly to theory. The small moments matter. Now, clinical debriefing is something that I'm just going to touch on because tomorrow there's a great session by Sonia Twig that you can attend. But basically, clinical debriefing is this idea that we can learn from our work. It need not be the big cases that we tend to hear about in M&Ms, but every day there's something that we can learn from. The theory behind this actually comes from the cycling world. Some of you may be familiar with the theory of marginal gains, this idea that we can get 1% better every day, and if we don't, we're just going to head in the other direction. There's some really simple ways that you can debrief with your time. This is one strategy that we're about to roll out at the Gold Coast. Very simple structure, a conversation that really anybody can lead. Think of getting to the CT scanner fast and safe, perhaps after an intubated patient, or maybe just at the end of this day. Conversations about how we improve and our desire to improve will continue to make our teams thrive and will continue to improve the care that we provide to patients. The small moments matter. Another place where we can impact culture is in the simulation room. We have found that simulations that are as simple as a flat piece of paper on the table where clinicians are discussing their way through a case, all the way to as complex that include multiple teams in operating theaters and the emergency department. These are moments when we can shape the stories that we're telling and the stories about our work. This is what people say about simulation. It can be a ritual that shapes our culture deliberately. It's a small moment that matters. Now I want you to take a minute and go back to that person that you were chatting with at the beginning of this talk, and I want you to commit to one small moment. Maybe it already exists in the course of your day, but you want to focus on it and make it a little bit more meaningful. Or maybe it's something, one of the ideas here, that you think you might be able to apply in your work. This is something that you can do when you go back to the workplace after this conference, and I want you to commit with the person next to you that you might give it a go. I'll give you 30 seconds. All right. So that is about 400 small moments that will matter. And I look forward to your experience in giving it a go with your teams. Now, if you want to read more and get a bit more nerdy about culture and how it impacts our workplace, these are 3 great books that I would highly recommend. They certainly have transformed the way that I interact with my teams, and I think they will you as well. I'm not naive enough to think that our teams are isolated from our systems and environments. We know that work is really hard right now, and we know that it is hard because of what we're being asked to do with the resources that we have. There is no doubt that these systems level issues require addressing, and they require energy and time, and when those are improved, our workplaces will improve too. But right now, our teams are the buffers between those systems level problems and our patients. Our teams need us to be engaging in these small moments, to be enacting these rituals. They need us to be doing that now. And when I think about it, I'm reminded of starlings. Starlings are these amazing animals that fly in flocks called murmurations, and they move with this degree of complexity that is just beautiful. And really, this is what happens in healthcare. We, as a system, are working and moving and adapting and changing. But the amazing part about starlings is the way that they fly is they can only pay attention and only influence the 7 other birds that are around them. So they're paying attention to the people or birds who are in their proximity, paying attention to the birds who are in their proximity and changing their movements based on that. This reminds me that we have the ability to impact the people who are in our proximity, those 7 people that show up to work with you on a shift. And if we want to move the way that this flock is moving, all we can do is impact the 7 people around us. I choose to do that through small moments, and I think you can too. So as we walk back into work tomorrow, Instead of hoping that this shift goes well, we'll make sure it does. Thank you.
Eve, thank you so much. I would speculate that your movements have affected slightly more than 7 people in the last 25 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks.
Ian, do we have any questions on Twitter?
Look, I'd love to pretend that there was a question coming from a huge fan of Eve's on Twitter. It's my question, and I am a huge fan of Eve's.
On Twitter.
And on Twitter. Eve, I think probably there's lots of departments that feel like they want things like huddles and end-of-shifts debriefs, and they're finding it hard to compete against the service deliveries. And I'm wondering how it is that you could suggest that a team that wants to initiate these sorts of processes can combat it against the day-to-day work and the flows that are going on around them.
Ian, that is an excellent question, and it is certainly one that at the Gold Coast we have not figured out. In fact, it is quite a big challenge to start new rituals, and especially when people feel like they just need to crack on and get to work. I would argue that when the department is the busiest is the time that we need these the most. The moment when it feels chaotic is the moment when our team needs to come together and spend 5 minutes deciding how they're going to sort this. Right now, within our department, certainly this is something that individual clinicians are choosing to do or not. And so I think regardless of what the department is doing, individual clinicians have the opportunity, and certainly leaders on teams have the opportunity to make this choice, and that's kind of what is happening now. At a department level, certainly this would be something that if I was a department leader, I would be deliberately fostering and creating. We all know that 5 minutes in the emergency department is not going to fix what's in front of us. We're probably fooling ourselves if we think otherwise. So I guess there's probably some high-level department decisions that could support it, but in the meantime, individual clinicians can decide with their team, with their 7 people that they can influence, that this is something that matters.
Thank you. Are there any raised hands in the audience for other questions? Meters gained for Dr. Ben Simon.
Hi Eve, long time listener, first time caller, big fan. One thing, I have struggled with huddles. This is a genuine question, not a plant, even though I love you. I struggle with the cheese factor sometimes with huddles, and I've found that sometimes the huddle starts with good intentions, and then after a couple of weeks, people find it kind of cheesy and performative, and it drops off. So my question is, how do you create a huddle with authenticity that an organization wants to perpetuate?
Oh, I think that's a great question. And I think it probably depends context to context. So you can imagine if you're working with the same set of people every day, it actually seems a bit silly to stand around and introduce yourselves. That's certainly not the context that I work in and may not be the context that others work in. So adapting the need to what your group desires, I think, is really important. And so if introductions is not what you need, sorting out what would be of value to your team for 5 minutes of discussion, I think would be pretty beneficial. And then there's always this balance between, is there a script or is it something that just people do? It turns out that Dr. Simon, you are excellent at leading conversations, and that is not a skill that many people feel they have. And so a few words that seem cheesy actually are quite empowering, even though it feels a bit funny. Whereas for you or others that actually get in the kind of role of leading them, may just end up adapting it to a bit of a conversation that's, hi, what do you want to learn today? So I think there's not necessarily a template that has to be rigidly stuck to, but that template can provide some help for people that feel like they can't do it otherwise.
Thank you. We've got time for one more question.
I was just going to say, Eve, thanks very much for that. And I'm going to start huddling again. And I was just saying, you know, how it was more of a comment, but Ben was saying about how you do the cheese factor, but we did we used to huddle quite a lot, and all the same people. And then one day someone said, "Hi, it's me. I'm feeling really fragile today because my husband's best friend died, and so I just need you guys to be a bit calmer for us." Like, just be gentle with me today. And so that was really so important. So eventually, if you keep on doing it, you get those gems where people feel vulnerable enough to say that, and it really connects the group. And I think it's time well invested.
Yeah, and I think the only thing that I would add to that as well is from our research in the emergency department, specifically about psychological safety, we have very strong evidence that leaders within the group over-predict how safe their group feels. And so what feels cheesy to you as the leader doing this may just be barely getting your team up to the minimum of feeling like they can take an interpersonal risk, of feeling like they're respected. And so I would really caution leaders within this group to not think that your teams are safe. They are not as safe as we think they are.
Dr. Eve Purdy, thank you so much.
Thanks.